When I watched Swami toward the end of his life, a certain simplicity set in to his manner of presenting the spiritual teachings that had not been there so much in the early years. Most of you have been in this temple before, but Swami Kriyananda is the founder of this particular expression of these masters' teachings, of Yogananda's teachings, an American disciple of Yogananda who led Ananda since its beginnings in the mid-60s, and he passed away in April at the age of 86. April of just not quite a year ago. And I was with him for 40 years or more. So I watched the progression not only of the development of Ananda from just a very primitive rural environment, but the development of Ananda in 1,000 different ways, and the progression of much of Swami Kriyananda's incarnation. He was in his 40s when I met him, so I missed the part that made him who he was by the time I met him. But I watched the cycle of spiritual expression, being not quite 86 myself, but more than 22, which is where I started. I'm also playing the game of time right now, which I was saying to a friend this morning, time is an odd duck. It's a very odd duck. It doesn't behave in the way that we anticipate it. We have it all worked out what time really is, and the more of it we experience, the less it stays into the neat box that we expect it to stay in. And there's a strong relationship, I don't know how to say it exactly, between our own consciousness and time, which is that we have this idea that it takes time for things to develop. And partly because we have that belief, and it is our experience, it does take time for things to develop. And years pass, and willpower is exerted, and small children become big children. Last night we had the last performance of our school play, which is always a huge event. This is a huge theatrical production. It's not a children's play by any normal concept. And the alumni of our school often come back. And since our school only goes to 8th grade, after they leave our school is often when they shift from being children into men and women. And 4 of the particularly big guys who used to be little were sort of wandering around being bigger than their parents in that adolescent vitality. It was really impressive to see them all together. And of course, if you've witnessed, I think children are one of the greatest ways in which we watch time pass, because the inevitable change that they go through, by the time you get to here, the change happens, but it's more incremental. It just kind of creeps up on you. And you think there's something wrong with your mirror. Just a ridiculous story, which all the women in the room will understand. For 5 years, I changed my hairdresser every couple of months. I thought it was her fault somehow. And finally, one lady said to me, "Honey, everything gets old, including your hair." At which point I kind of got that a graceful acceptance was in order. When I first met Swami Kriyananda, I, being an intellectually oriented person, I loved his intelligence. He was just so darn smart and highly educated and knowledgeable about a vast number of things, and I began to realize later, had the capacity to access knowledge, not only wisdom, which is different than knowledge, but he also had the capacity to access knowledge. He talked about Master Yogananda in the same way, that if you live at the heart of reality, if you think of all of reality as a wheel and spokes leading from the center, if you're at the center, you can follow any spoke. Swamiji talked about how Master was able to be conversant with whoever came to see him. If they were artists, he could talk about art. If they were doctors, he could talk about medicine. If they were businessmen, he could talk about business. And it wasn't merely that he had the art of conversation down where he could ask questions and be a good listener. He could actually contribute knowledgeable, creative insights. Because when you stand at the center, that's where everything comes together. And the principles that you understand can then be applied in all directions. Well, Swamiji had that kind of intelligence. And since the intelligence that I had been trained in, insofar as I was trained, which was not very much, had all been from the outside in, from reading lots of books, and that was all before the internet, and interesting magazines, and that sort of gathering of information and then thinking about it and putting it together. There was a quality to his intelligence that just startled me. That's the only word I can use. I was startled by the way he could travel through so many different subjects and realities. Yes, he had an enormously broad background. He was raised with 4 languages and grew up in Europe and had traveled all over the world by the time I met him. But still, it was something different. And I actually would meditate on, because I wanted to be intelligent in that way. I said, what makes him so intelligent? And the odd answer that came to me, which has taken me most of my life to really understand, is that his intelligence comes from his heart. I mean, we tend to think of intelligence as coming from here, and people's posture sometimes reflects where they live from. And I find myself, I tend to lean into life. It's like if I can get the frontal lobe of my brain sort of there first, it's like it'll tell the rest of me what to do. And you see, that's how people live. Sometimes people lead with their tummies, you know? It's sort of like, it just depends on who we are. Master had this thing, the psychological chart, and he had little pictures. He said if people actually looked like what they were, and then he had some people that were just big tummies and tiny heads, and then people who were just big brains. My own picture of myself has always been a mouth. Just a pair of like Minnie Mouse shoes and a mouth, like that. And the shoes carry me, and then I talk. That's sort of how it is. When I was talking to my friends about they were trying to start a new Ananda in Los Angeles, and to me, the only thing you need to start a center is a microphone. That's all, just to talk, you know. You don't need a place, you don't need anything. You just need to be able to pass along what's there. So I contemplated Swamiji, and somehow I sensed it, and I think that was intuitive. I sensed that it came from his heart. Interestingly, I read not too long ago that as medical science advances, you know, and they can examine living beings more and more exactly with all the imaging techniques they have, they've discovered a strong physiological similarity between the heart and the brain. Whereas before they thought they were physically completely different, and I don't mean connected, I mean the same, now I'm so ignorant about these things, but the same gray matter is the actual word the article used. The same gray matter that's in the brain is also in the heart. That people actually literally think with their hearts, which is fascinating because it's a spiritual principle. And coming back to Swamiji, his posture when he was young was that if you looked at him in profile, his heart was a little bit ahead of his head. And it wasn't because he was fat at all. He was quite slender in those days. But it was like he pushed out toward the world first. What he wanted to get there first was his acceptance and love of the world around him. And that's a very profound reality. The first thing he wanted to have happen was that kind of connectedness. Because once you have that kind of connectedness, everything else follows. I have had the opportunity to write 2 books that are stories of people's significant spiritual experiences. The first book was stories of people's experiences with Swami Kriyananda, which, inasmuch as he's always been the spiritual leader of this whole movement that we're a part of, often people's interaction with him was a pivotal part of their life. And because I was gathering stories, I talked to dozens of people, probably hundreds in the end, And they would look right at me, and they would tell me often about these pivotal experiences in their lives. And I can type without looking, so I was able to keep eye contact and still take notes while people would talk to me. And the more they would talk, the more the eyes would become window to the soul. And all of a sudden, this superficial little costume that we wear would literally, physically recede. And what would be coming through instead would be those beams of consciousness through people's eyes. Then later I wrote another book of people's experiences of miracles and answered prayers. Exactly the same experience. The second book, Miracles and Answered Prayers, was assigned to me to write by Swamiji. He initiated the project, very quickly lost interest, and just handed it to me. Here, Asha, you should write this book. I would never, not in a million years, have chosen to write that book. I just don't think like that. And I had done one book of stories, and I thought I was done with that. But he knew exactly what he was doing, because especially the experience of writing that book, I began to understand how you think with your heart. Because you see people in the world, and many people struggle. And when people start really telling you, how they grew up, what they had to deal with as an adult, and, the opportunities to go off track in our society are pretty limitless. Really enormous. You can drink, you can take drugs, you can gamble, you can fritter away your relationships, you can become estranged from your children, you can go bankrupt multiple times, you can, I won't tell you all that happens. You can become the victim of unscrupulous people, all these things happen. So you see everybody walking around, and we're all carrying all these realities. And it's all too easy to sort of see people according to the obvious. But when people give you their soul, which I've had the unique opportunity, people give you their soul, all of a sudden you realize that all of that is so superficial. All of that is the edge of the wheel, so to speak. And as you get closer and closer, we find that we're all standing in the same reality. Swamiji, and in that unity, you see, is where understanding comes. Because we're all a manifestation of the same essential force. Yesterday I gave a class, and the subject was the path of Kriya. And Kriya is the name of the essential practices that we follow here. Everything that we're doing here is Kriya, although Kriya also means a very specific technique that involves the breath. And in the course of trying to explain this to the group in the room, a very interesting thought struck me, which is that everything this is an obvious spiritual thought, but everything comes back down to the breath. And the breath is also the definition of life, isn't it? The baby is born, and you're anxious until that baby takes its first breath. Because even the perfect body, there's no guarantee of its continuance until that breath is taken. And yesterday in our home in the afternoon, the brother of a dear friend, many of you know Vidura, his brother who used to come to this church, he died earlier in this week. He had early onset Alzheimer's. So he was only just almost exactly my age. But for the last 6 years, he's been in a decline. And his brother and his wife and other of their family were right by his bedside when that very last breath came. And they were telling a very interesting story that Vidura was sitting there with him, and just intuitively he suddenly had the thought to say one of the Sanskrit mantras that we say every morning, every Sunday when we do the fire ceremony. He started repeating that mantra out loud. The last phrase of that mantra, we say Om Swaha, which is, I offer myself into the infinite. He literally said Om Swaha, and his brother breathed out, and that was the end. So much more is going on this planet than we realize. And we live in these physical bodies and we think this is what's happening, and we analyze things according to all of these external factors. We don't think first with the heart. We don't think about others first with the heart. And we don't think about ourselves first with the heart. We think about all the conditions that limit us and make us anxious, and not enough about the realities that make us absolutely free. I mean, not even a little bit free, but absolutely free. This is the odd duck about time, is that this time is manifested, you see, in the material world. That time, space, matter, all of it depends on itself. If nothing is changing and nothing is moving, then where is time? And what happens to a person who meditates for a while and thinks about spiritual things a lot and tries to define life in terms of attunement with great souls whose consciousness is infinite, we move in from the edge and we get closer and closer to the center. And the center is the unchanging now, the part that is just always the same, and everything else spins around it. And so from that perspective, in a very real sense, you watch time, but you don't experience it in the same way. I remember one of my dear friends, her mother was a very childlike person. She said, "I know I look 70, but inside I'm about 32. And a mother of a friend said, when she was literally dying in the hospital, "I thought when I was older I would get wiser, but I didn't." It's so sweet, but in a sense you do. Since I'm into death stories of mothers, the woman, for those of you who've seen the Finding Happiness movie, the woman whose own death I described in that movie, when her mother died, she was a very devoted Catholic with a special love for Mary. And on her deathbed, the woman had hardly moved or spoken. And just before she passed, she suddenly sat up in bed, seeing something that no one else could see. "Mary, Mary!" And then just like a child, she started saying, "Hi, Mary, hi, Mary." Just like that. But with that, just thinking from the heart. There was no thought that this is the Holy Mother of Jesus and, the Mother of our Lord and all of those different things. It was that Mary had been her mother. Just as simple as that. And when she showed up, she was just so excited to see her. Just thrilled with that spirit. When Swamiji would see us, his greeting, which many of you know, he would always say, "Hello, great souls," just like that. And I used to think it was an affirmation. I would think how nice of him, to tell us that you poor morons have a chance, But on a much deeper level, and especially after I wrote the book about miracles and answered prayers, everyone is a great soul, because everyone is a soul. Everyone has. It's so hard to comprehend, because in this world, you see, we're all so different. Because there is such a thing as increasing awareness. If self-realization is a possibility, then that means that some people have got more of it. But it's realization that they have, not self, not divine self. Nobody has a bigger soul than anybody else. Isn't it? We always think that way, that because we're so material, that, great souls must have really big souls, just like as big as a building. I'm not a devotee of Monty Python, but somebody just sent me a vignette, one of his little scenes, and there's a very British preacher in a very British church standing up in one of those cages, that they would have where they climb the stairs and they would stand above everyone. I read a Reader's Digest true story about a father who took his little child to some fire and brimstone church where the preacher was up in one of those things. This is children out of the mouths of babes The preacher is raging at the congregation about sin and hell and all these things. The little child's up against her father. Finally, he pulls on his sleeve and he says, "Daddy, what will we do if he gets loose?" Well, in this Monty Python, some guy is up here, and his British accent is so thick that at first you can't understand what he's saying. And then finally you realize that in all this different language he's spinning out, he's trying to describe the weight and volume of God, just to tell us how really huge he is. Just huge and bigger, than most average things that you see. Like even this building is dwarfed by the size of God. Just thinking only with the mind. It's like, if he's powerful, then he must be bigger than the building. And that's why, in the very Kali Yuga times, that's why the cathedrals got bigger and bigger. Higher and higher on the ceiling, longer and longer. And the European cities would compete, and you'd see on the floor that such and so, a cathedral is only this big, but our cathedral is actually this big. And the higher up it is, probably the closer it is to God. And really sane people who weren't stupid were actually doing that. I mean, it was a time when we didn't have, collectively, on the planet, an expanded understanding of reality. But you're just thinking with the head. You're not really feeling from the heart where greatness really comes from. And also what greatness looks like in the eyes of God. Our friend who's passing, we were celebrating yesterday, Vidura's brother. It was so touching to me because everybody who knew him well, and I only knew him at the end of his life, except when you know someone, you sort of know his family without ever knowing them, because you're always part of their world from the edge. But everyone said about him, he treated everyone exactly the same. He loved everyone, and he treated them all exactly the same. When the final tally is taken of what really matters in life, your stock portfolio, the size of your house, the fact that all your children went to Harvard, I mean, it's nice if you do your duty well. We don't get out of karma by doing it badly, as Swamiji told me once. But in the end, what really matters is a very simple question. How much did you love? And on what basis did you offer your love? Well, this one really loves me, so I'll certainly love him back. This one can further my career, and that one is so popular. He's so popular, I'll really love him. Or do we love because it just comes out of us, that we just lead from the heart? And when we begin to see everyone on this same journey that we are on. I was driving down the road the other day. I just came back from India, and so I'm really interested in the way it looks around here, because it looks so different. I surrendered completely to being where I was for the last 2 months, and so it's very interesting here. I mean, there's so many people in India. You don't really get the concept of large numbers of people like you do when you go there. When one of our friends came to America for the first time, we were showing him the city, and then we crossed the Golden Gate Bridge and we went up to the lookout point, and it was actually rush hour, and the Golden Gate Bridge was pretty full. But he turns to us and he says, "Where are the people?" I said, well, they're all neatly inside those cars. They're all just folded up inside those cars. Because that bus would have, in India, that bridge would have all the same number of cars, but it would also have thousands of people and thousands of visible people on bicycles and motorcycles and rickshaws and so on like that. So you don't see, everything's so tidy here. It's very, very tidy. Everything in America is really clean. I feel like Monty Python. Like America is like really clean, and in order and square. But, every so often something breaks out, because there's this guy wandering around with a bicycle and a huge basket full of whatever it is that he considers valuable. He's obviously not functioning in a way that the world would consider successful. His
posture was depressed, and he's pushing his bicycle, shuffling along like this with his basket full of whatever. I guess because I'd just been in India so long, I was just in the car, but I'm just looking at him. Wow, how did you end up there? And what does it feel like to be you? Because everyone lives inside their own reality. And their own reality makes perfect sense to them. That's the most amazing thing. Even the most irrational person that everyone would say, and is true, is out of touch with objective reality, it makes sense to them. And often there's a fascinating internal logic once you start with the premises that they have. I was delirious with a fever once. And I just had a very high, I wasn't really, I was delirious, but I had a really high fever, which I rarely have. And I remember lying in bed in the fetal position like this. It was in my parents' house. This was 30 years ago. I was an adult person. But I was lying there, and I was very aware of the fact that I needed to stay curled up, because if I stretched out, my body would break into 4 pieces. My hands would run away and my feet would run away, and then I'd break into 4 pieces. And I was cogent enough to realize I didn't want to do that. So I stayed curled up like this. And I guess as the fever began to come down, it occurred to me that many times in my life I had stretched out and I hadn't broken into 4 pieces. And so I very, very gingerly experimented and discovered, wow, look at that. But reflecting on it, I realized how it's not that hard to fall into loony ideas. And this man on the street, if I had tried to engage him in a conversation, I suspect he had some ideas that I would consider really loony, really disconnected from the actual way the material world works. But really, is our fear of death any less loony? Is our anxiety and feeling so lonely and unloved in this world? Is our desperate need to dull our consciousness with substances and food and television? Just think of it. Think of every thought form we have that is based on this rational analysis of, if I don't do it, who's going to take care of me? Versus the sense that comes from when we lead from the heart. And I will now make the slightest reference to our scripture reading today, when Jesus asked Peter, "Who am I?" And when Peter answered, he just knew. He might have been able to make a list of objective reasons. Well, you did raise the dead, you are healing, and various things like that. But none of that would persuade. But when we're heart to heart, we just know. And it's a knowledge that just simply cannot be taken away from us. This belongs to me. This is mine. This is my reality. This is reality. This is what is. And Jesus had touched Peter on a level that so far transcends the edge of the wheel, just right to the center, that there was no other place to go. Later on, another related passage to this one, when many disciples were deserting Jesus, and Jesus again turned to Peter, and he said, it's very poignant when you think of it as real life. Well, a lot of them are leaving now. Are you going to leave me too? Peter's answer was perfect. Peter said, where could I go? He didn't say, oh no, I have it really down, sir. I know exactly who you are, and I've worked it out, and this is all of these things. He said, where could I go? When you're standing in the center, where could you go? There is no there. There is no other. There just is the one simple, true reality. I started all of this by saying that watching Swamiji simplify over 4 decades, and that's what he really did. He just simplified. At the beginning, he spent a great deal of time telling us all the teachings of Master. And fortunately, almost all of it was recorded, and we have hundreds of fabulous classes. He explains it all. And as he got toward the end, and himself just, he was always at the center, but he relaxed more and more into the center. He would just talk about Guru. He would talk about his relationship with Yogananda. He would tell us over and over again how he found autobiography and how he was initiated as a disciple. And he would cry sooner and sooner in the telling of that story. It used to be that there would be a certain point where his voice would choke. But by the end, all he'd had to do was even just mention Master's name or his relationship as a disciple, and that was it. He'd come right to the center point. Heart first, right to the center. Nothing else is needed. God bless you.